The fire started at 2:13 a.m. I know that because I checked the time 3 separate times while standing barefoot across the street, watching smoke pour out of the apartment building I'd lived in for almost 4 years. At first, nobody even realized how bad it was. Someone burned food all the time in our building. Fire alarms were practically background noise. But then I opened my apartment door and saw smoke rolling down the hallway ceiling, thick and dark and wrong. Everything after that blurred together. Voices yelling, someone crying, cold pavement under my feet, the sharp chemical smell of smoke clinging to my clothes. By sunrise, half the building was taped off and firefighters were still moving in and out like shadows. One of them finally approached me with tired eyes and said the words I'd been dreading. You won't be able to go back in for a while. A while. As if that meant anything. I remember standing there holding a garbage bag with the few things I'd managed to grab: my wallet, phone charger, 2 hoodies, a pair of jeans, trying to figure out where the hell I was supposed to go. My dad called 20 minutes later. You okay? Yeah, I lied automatically. He exhaled hard. Thank God. Dad lived almost 3 hours away, and even if he'd offered, I wasn't going there. We loved each other, but too much time under the same roof usually turned into arguments disguised as conversations. I'm fine, I repeated. You can stay with Dylan. I frowned immediately. Who? Dylan? He said again, like that cleared things up. My friend. I don't know any Dylan. You met him once. Years ago. That narrowed it down to absolutely nobody. Dad had one of those personalities where everyone was apparently his friend. Mechanics. Old coworkers. Random guys from fishing trips 15 years ago. I can get a hotel, I said. With what money? I stayed quiet. That's what I thought, he replied. Dylan's got a spare room. He already said yes. Something tightened in my chest. I don't really want to live with some stranger. He's not a stranger. He is to me. Dad sighed. Axel, it's temporary. Temporary. That word again. 3 hours later, I was standing outside a narrow, dark gray townhouse in a quiet neighborhood I'd never been to before, carrying everything I still owned in 2 trash bags and a backpack. I almost turned around twice before knocking. The door opened faster than I expected, and suddenly, temporary felt a lot more complicated. Dylan looked nothing like I imagined. For one thing, he was young. Not my dad's age. Not even close. Maybe 26. 27 max. Tall. Dark blonde hair falling messily across his forehead. Gray sweatshirt sleeves pushed to his elbows. The kind of face that looked serious even before he spoke. We just stared at each other for a second. You're Axel. Not a question. Yeah. His eyes flicked down to the trash bags in my hands for half a second before moving back up. You can come in. That was it. No smile. No awkward introduction. Just calm, steady eye contact that somehow made me more nervous. I stepped inside, immediately hit by warmth and the smell of coffee. The place was clean in a way that didn't feel staged. Soft lighting, bookshelves, a couch that actually looked lived in instead of decorative. It felt quiet. Safe, almost. Dylan closed the door behind me. My dad said you two were friends. We are. The answer came too fast for follow-up questions. He took one of the bags from my hand before I could protest. You can use the guest room upstairs. I followed him through the townhouse, trying not to stare too obviously. There was something restrained about him. Like every movement was controlled on purpose. Even his voice stayed level, low and even. You hungry? He asked while heading upstairs. I'm okay. You haven't eaten. I blinked. How do you know? You look shaky. That annoyed me mostly because he was right. Little bit, I admitted. He nodded once like he'd expected that. The guest room was simple but nice. Gray blankets. Desk by the window. No clutter anywhere. You can stay as long as you need, he said. Something about the sentence made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Because until then, everything had felt unstable. Temporary. Floating. But standing there in that quiet room, listening to someone I barely knew say you can stay, almost made me feel human again. Thanks, I said quietly. Dylan leaned against the doorway for a second. You don't have to look terrified, he said. I let out a surprised laugh. I'm trying not to. That bad. My entire apartment building almost burned down 6 hours ago, I replied. So emotionally. I'd say medium bad. That finally got a small smile out of him. It changed his whole face. And for some reason, that made me even more nervous. Bathrooms across the hall, he said. I made coffee earlier if you want some. Thanks. He nodded once and disappeared downstairs. I waited until his footsteps faded before sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. Then I looked around the unfamiliar room again and realized something unsettling. I wanted Dylan to come back, which made absolutely no sense. The first few days felt strange in the specific way only forced closeness can. Not awkward exactly, just unfamiliar. Dylan worked from home most of the time, which meant I saw him constantly. Morning coffee in the kitchen, late night walks downstairs when I couldn't sleep, quiet music drifting from his office during the afternoon. And somehow, despite being a near stranger, he never made me feel like I was intruding. That should have relaxed me. Instead, it made me hyper-aware of him. "You can use the washer whenever," he said on my second day there. "Thanks. There's food in the fridge." "Okay. You don't have to ask permission for everything." That one caught me off guard. I looked up from the counter. "Sorry. You apologize a lot," he observed calmly. I frowned. "Do I?" "Yeah." "Huh." He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, then added casually, "Usually means someone spent too much time feeling like a burden." I stared at him. "How did you just psychoanalyze me over bottled water?" One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Lucky guess. But it didn't feel like a guess. That was the weird thing about Dylan. He noticed everything. Not in an invasive way. Just quietly. He noticed I stopped eating when stressed. Noticed I paced during phone calls. Noticed I slept badly after the fire and kept waking up at tiny sounds. One night around midnight, I wandered downstairs because sleep felt impossible again and found him sitting on the back patio wrapped in a hoodie, reading. He looked up immediately. "Can't sleep?" "Nope." He closed the book without even marking the page. "Sit." So I did. The backyard was quiet except for distant traffic and wind moving through the trees. For a while, neither of us talked. Then he asked, "You want to tell me what's going on in your head or keep aggressively pretending you're fine?" I laughed softly into my coffee mug. Was I aggressively pretending? A little. I stared out into the dark yard. "It's stupid." "It probably isn't." I hesitated, then finally admitted the thing I hadn't said out loud yet. "I think the fire messed me up more than I realized." Dylan stayed quiet, which somehow made it easier to continue. "Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking about how fast everything disappeared," I said quietly. "Like 1 second my life existed normally, and then suddenly I owned whatever I could carry in a trash bag." The words sounded pathetic once spoken aloud. But Dylan didn't look uncomfortable. "Yeah," he said softly. "That'll do it." I glanced at him. "That's your advice?" "That's my confirmation you're reacting like a normal person." The tightness in my chest loosened slightly. "You know," he added after a second, "you don't always have to recover immediately." I looked down at my hands. "My dad says I overreact to things." Dylan snorted quietly. "Your dad also thinks gas station coffee is acceptable. We all have flaws." That laugh escaped me before I could stop it. And suddenly something shifted. Small, subtle, but real. Because for the first time since the fire, I didn't feel like someone being temporarily stored somewhere until my real life restarted. I just felt okay being there. And honestly, that scared me a little. By the second week, Dylan stopped treating me like a guest. And somehow, that was worse. Not because he was rude. Because he wasn't. He just started acting like I belonged there. He'd leave coffee waiting on the counter if he knew I'd been awake late. He started buying the cereal I liked without mentioning it. One morning I came downstairs and found my laundry folded neatly on the couch. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds. Then I walked straight into his office. "You folded my clothes?" Dylan looked up from his laptop calmly. "Yeah." "Why?" "You left them in the dryer." "That doesn't explain why you folded them." His expression stayed completely serious. "Would you have preferred I throw them directly onto the floor?" I crossed my arms. "You're weird." "That's fair." But he was smiling slightly when he looked back at his screen. That became the problem. The smiling. At first, Dylan had seemed almost intimidating. Quiet. Controlled. Hard to read. But once he relaxed around me a little, I started noticing things. Like how dry his humor actually was. How he muttered to himself while cooking. How his voice changed when he was tired, lower, rougher, softer around the edges. And unfortunately, my brain started cataloging all of it. A dangerous development. One night, I came downstairs around 1 a.m. and found him asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest. I stopped halfway into the living room. The TV cast soft blue light across the room, catching against his face. His hair was messier than usual, one arm hanging off the side of the couch. He looked younger asleep, less guarded. I should have gone back upstairs immediately. Instead, I stood there way too long. Because there's something intimate about seeing someone asleep, especially someone who always seems composed when they're awake. Like you're accidentally witnessing a version of them nobody else gets. Then Dylan shifted slightly and opened his eyes. Directly at me. My entire nervous system short-circuited. Jesus Christ, I muttered. Do you always wake up like a horror movie character? His voice was rough with sleep. Why are you standing there like you're about to rob me? I came for water. You already have water upstairs. Damn it. I forgot. His mouth twitched faintly. Sure. I grabbed a random glass from the kitchen, mostly to preserve dignity. You couldn't sleep? He asked quietly. Not really. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand across his face. Nightmares. I leaned against the counter. Little bit. He nodded like he understood without needing details. That was another thing about Dylan. He never forced conversations. He just made room for them. You want to watch something? He asked after a second. At 1 in the morning? You're already awake. You say that like it's logical. Is it working? Unfortunately, yes. 20 minutes later, we were sitting opposite ends of the couch watching some terrible late-night crime documentary while the rain hit softly against the windows. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, I was painfully aware of everything. How close his knee was to mine. How relaxed he sounded at this hour. How safe the room felt. At one point, the documentary interviewed someone so obviously guilty that I snorted into my drink. Dylan glanced sideways at me. What? That guy definitely did it. Based on, he has guilty eyebrows. Dylan stared at me for a long moment, then unexpectedly laughed. Not polite amusement, an actual laugh. It startled me so much I started laughing too. And suddenly the whole room felt lighter. The documentary kept playing forgotten in the background while we drifted into easier conversation. Childhood stories, terrible jobs, random memories. Turns out Dylan had known my dad for years because they worked together briefly before starting different careers. He talks about you constantly, by the way, Dylan said casually. I groaned immediately. Oh no, he's proud of you. The words hit harder than they should have. I looked down at my drink. He has a weird way of showing it sometimes. Dylan was quiet for a second. Yeah, he said carefully. He does. Something about the way he answered made me look up. There was history there. Not bad exactly. Just complicated. Before I could ask, Dylan looked back toward the TV. You were really scared that night, huh? The softness in his voice caught me off guard. I swallowed. Yeah. He nodded slowly. I could tell. And suddenly the air between us felt different again. Quieter. Heavier. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Because nobody had said that to me yet. Nobody had acknowledged how terrified I actually was. Everyone else kept focusing on logistics. Insurance. Temporary housing. Replacing things. But Dylan looked at me like he understood that losing your home wasn't just about stuff. It was about feeling untethered. For a second, neither of us moved. Then his phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table, breaking whatever had settled between us. Dylan glanced down at the screen. His expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just closed off. He grabbed the phone face down too quickly. You good? I asked. Yeah. Too fast. I frowned slightly. Everything okay? Work thing. But he didn't sound convincing. And for the first time since moving in, I realized something important. Dylan noticed everything about me, but I knew almost nothing about him. The realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Because once I noticed Dylan avoiding certain topics, I couldn't stop seeing it. Whenever conversations drifted toward relationships, he redirected smoothly. Whenever his phone buzzed late at night, he'd glance down and mute it almost immediately. Sometimes he disappeared onto the back patio for quiet phone calls he clearly didn't want me overhearing. Not suspicious exactly, just private. And logically, that should have been normal. We barely knew each other. But emotionally, I hated how curious I'd become, which was deeply annoying. 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know this man existed. Now I was lying awake wondering who texted him at midnight. Pathetic. One afternoon I was helping him cook mostly because he claimed I cut vegetables with concerning emotional intensity. I'm just chopping onions. You're attacking them personally. I rolled my eyes. Maybe they deserve it. Dylan snorted softly while stirring something on the stove. Domestic. The word hit me suddenly and hard. The kitchen smelled like garlic and coffee. Music played quietly from somewhere in the house. Rain tapped against the windows again. It felt comfortable in a dangerous kind of way. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't. but the screen lit up bright enough to catch my attention anyway. You still ignoring me? No name. Just the message. Dylan grabbed the phone instantly. Too instantly. Something uncomfortable twisted in my stomach. He slid the phone into his pocket and continued cooking like nothing happened. But the mood shifted after that. At least for me. Because suddenly I became painfully aware that Dylan had an entire life outside this house. One I knew almost nothing about. And for reasons I absolutely did not want to examine too closely, that bothered me. The worst part was that I didn't even have the right to feel weird about it. Dylan wasn't my boyfriend. Wasn't even technically my friend for that long. He was just the guy kind enough to let me stay in his house after my apartment burned down. So why was I suddenly irritated every time his phone lit up? Why did I notice when he disappeared for late-night calls? Why did I care? I tried fixing it the obvious way. Distance. For 2 whole days I stayed mostly upstairs pretending to job search, while aggressively avoiding the kitchen whenever Dylan was there. It failed immediately, mostly because Dylan noticed everything. On the second evening, there was a knock on my bedroom door. You alive in there? I looked up from my laptop. Depends who's asking. Dylan opened the door slightly, leaning against the frame. You skipped dinner. I wasn't hungry. You also skipped breakfast. Damn him. I had chips. That's not breakfast. That's depression with sodium. I laughed despite myself. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. You okay? There it was again. That calm directness. The thing about Dylan was that he never sounded intrusive when he asked questions. He sounded steady, like he genuinely wanted the answer, which made lying harder. I'm fine, I said anyway. MHM. I frowned. What does MHM mean? It means you've been hiding upstairs for 48 hours. I have not. You literally carried coffee upstairs this morning like a Victorian widow. That startled an actual laugh out of me. Dylan's expression softened immediately at the sound. And annoyingly, my chest reacted to that. You want to tell me what's going on? He asked. No, absolutely not. Because saying I think I'm weirdly jealous over mysterious text messages from a man I barely know seemed like an incredibly bad idea. So instead I shrugged. Just stressed. He watched me quietly for another second, then nodded once. Okay. But he clearly didn't believe me. Before leaving, he added casually, movie downstairs if you stop acting haunted. You always this bossy? Yes. Good to know. His mouth twitched slightly before he disappeared down the hall. I stared at the doorway for a long time afterward. Because the dangerous thing wasn't that I was attracted to Dylan anymore. That ship had sailed embarrassingly fast. The dangerous thing was that I liked him. Actually liked him. And those were always the feelings that ruined me the worst. An hour later, I finally went downstairs mostly because hiding in my room forever would have been humiliating. Dylan was already sprawled across the couch scrolling through movie options. You survived, he observed without looking up. Barely. He tossed me a blanket automatically the second I sat down. Tiny gesture. Completely devastating. We ended up watching some awful action movie neither of us cared about. Halfway through, Dylan muttered, "This guy should not legally be allowed near explosives." That's your issue with this movie? He drove a motorcycle through a helicopter. Fair point. He laughed softly again. God, I was in trouble. Around midnight the movie ended, but neither of us moved to turn anything else on. Rain tapped quietly against the windows. The room stayed dim except for the TV glow. Then Dylan's phone buzzed again on the coffee table. I saw his jaw tighten before he even picked it up. He stared at the screen this time, instead of flipping it over immediately. Something unreadable crossed his face. You don't have to ignore it because I'm here, I said before I could stop myself. His eyes flicked toward me. I'm not. The answer came quietly. Honestly, which somehow made things worse. He rubbed a hand across his face before setting the phone back down. Complicated situation? I asked carefully. For a second I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he leaned back against the couch cushions and exhaled slowly. You ever keep trying to force yourself to want something that just doesn't fit anymore? The question caught me off guard. I said intelligently. Yeah. Dylan stared toward the dark TV screen. I dated someone for almost 2 years, he said quietly. Or tried to. That explained absolutely nothing and somehow everything at once. She wanted different things than I did. The sentence sounded uncertain, like even now he wasn't fully convinced. You don't sound sure. I'm not, he admitted. I stayed quiet. Dylan glanced down at his hands. She was good for me, he said carefully. At least on paper. Something in my chest tightened unexpectedly, because there was something sad about the way he said it. like he'd been trying very hard to feel something correctly. "What happened?" I asked softly. He laughed once under his breath. I kept waiting to feel the way I was apparently supposed to. The room went very still, and suddenly I understood. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Dylan looked over at me then, expression unreadable in the dim light. "For a long time I thought something was wrong with me," he admitted quietly. The vulnerability in his voice hit me hard, because until now Dylan had always seemed composed, grounded, like someone impossible to shake. But this version of him felt different, more open, more human. My chest ached unexpectedly. "What changed?" I asked. His eyes held mine for a second too long. Then he looked away first. I stopped lying to myself. The air between us shifted instantly. Not dramatic, not obvious, just charged. Like suddenly both of us became aware of something that had already been growing quietly for weeks. Neither of us moved. Then Dylan's phone buzzed again loudly against the coffee table. This time he didn't even look at it. Instead, he looked at me. And for one terrifying second, I thought he might say something that would change everything. Neither of us spoke. That was the problem. Because silence can become something dangerous when two people are already thinking the same thing. The rain kept hitting the windows softly. The room stayed dim and warm. Dylan kept looking at me like he'd forgotten how to look away. And I realized, suddenly and horribly, that I wanted him to say it. Whatever it was. The realization made my pulse spike instantly. Dylan noticed. Of course he did. His expression shifted slightly, not smug, not surprised. Just careful. Like he understood exactly how fragile the moment had become. Then he leaned forward, grabbed his buzzing phone, and muted it completely. The sound disappearing somehow made the room feel even quieter. "You should probably answer that eventually," I said softly. "Probably." But he made no move to do it. I swallowed hard. "Dylan." "Yeah." The way he said it low, attentive, completely focused on me nearly ruined me on the spot. I looked away first. Big mistake. Because the second I broke eye contact, I became painfully aware of everything else instead. How close we were sitting. How late it was. How long this tension had been building without either of us admitting it. My chest felt tight. "I think," I started carefully, "that maybe we should be normal for a second." Dylan's mouth twitched faintly. "We've been normal? You know what I mean." "Not really." I looked back at him then, mostly because avoiding his face was impossible. "That thing happening right now," I said quietly. "Maybe we acknowledge it before I lose my mind." Something softened immediately in his expression. Not relief exactly. Recognition. "Okay," he said gently. The calmness of his voice made this worse somehow. Because I was absolutely not calm. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted. "That makes two of us. You seem a lot calmer about it." Dylan huffed a quiet laugh. "Axel, internally I'm having a terrible time." That startled a smile out of me. And there it was again. That feeling. Every time he made me laugh, something inside me loosened. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Dylan looked down briefly before speaking again. "I've been trying really hard not to make you uncomfortable." "You haven't." His eyes flicked back up immediately. I think both of us heard how fast I answered. The room shifted again. "God. I started." "I know what you meant," he said softly. "That should not have sounded as intimate as it did." I rubbed a hand across my face. "This is complicated." "Yeah. You're my dad's friend." "I'm barely your dad's friend," he muttered. I blinked. "What?" Dylan leaned back into the couch with a sigh. "We worked together years ago for like 6 months," he explained. "Your father just decided we were emotionally bonded forever." I stared at him. "You let me believe you were longtime best friends. You never asked follow-up questions." "That's insane." "That's fair." I laughed again before I could stop myself. Dylan watched me quietly while I did. And then suddenly neither of us was laughing anymore. Because something about the way he was looking at me now felt unmistakable. Warm. Careful. Wanting. My stomach flipped hard. "You know," he said slowly, "this would probably be easier if I liked you less." Every thought in my brain disappeared instantly. I just stared at him. Dylan looked mildly alarmed by his own honesty now, which somehow made it even worse. "Cool," I said after several painful seconds. "Great. Awesome thing to say to someone." He let out a low laugh and dragged a hand through his hair. "Sorry." "No. Actually, don't apologize," I replied quickly. "Because now I need to know if we're both losing our minds, or just me." His eyes held mine. "Not just you." The words landed somewhere deep in my chest. For a second, I genuinely forgot how to breathe. Because attraction was one thing. Tension was one thing. But hearing someone actually admit it out loud? Different. So much worse. Neither of us moved. Then Dylan said quietly, "Come here." My heart nearly stopped. "What?" His expression stayed soft. "Steady. Come here," he repeated. And somehow that was the moment I realized how badly gone I already was. Because there wasn't even hesitation. I moved closer automatically. The second I settled beside him on the couch, the air changed completely. Dylan looked down at me for a long moment like he was trying to decide something important. "You're nervous," he murmured. "Obviously." "Why?" I stared at him incredulously. "Because this feels insane." That earned another small smile. But his eyes stayed serious. "I'm not going to do anything you don't want." The sentence hit harder than it should have. Gentle. Certain. Careful with me. And suddenly I understood why being around Dylan felt so different from everyone else. He paid attention. Not performatively. Not strategically. He genuinely cared how I felt. My chest tightened painfully. "I know," I admitted softly. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Dylan lifted one hand slowly, slow enough that I could stop him if I wanted, and brushed his fingers lightly against my jaw. Just that. Nothing more. But the contact sent warmth straight through me. His expression shifted immediately when he felt me lean into it slightly. Something tender crossed his face so quickly it almost hurt to see. "Axel," he said quietly. The way he said my name felt dangerous, like standing too close to the edge of something huge. I swallowed hard. Then before I could overthink it, I whispered, "I think I've wanted you to do that for a while." Dylan closed his eyes briefly, like the confession physically affected him. And when he looked at me again, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing between us was ever going back to normal after tonight. Dylan didn't kiss me. Not immediately. And somehow that made everything more intense. Because after I admitted that after I basically confessed I'd been thinking about him for weeks, he just looked at me. Carefully. Like I mattered. His hand stayed against my jaw, warm and steady, while my entire nervous system completely collapsed. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how hard I've been trying to behave normally around you." That did not help my situation at all. I let out a shaky laugh. "You seemed pretty calm. I deserve an award for that performance." The honesty in his voice made my chest ache. Because suddenly, all the little moments from the past few weeks rearranged themselves in my head differently. The late-night conversations. The way he always noticed when I was upset. How gentle he became whenever I looked overwhelmed. It hadn't been one-sided. Not even close. Dylan's thumb brushed lightly against my cheek once before he slowly let his hand fall away again. The loss of contact felt immediate. He noticed that too. Of course he did. Something softer appeared in his expression. "You're really easy to read sometimes," he murmured. "Cool. Humiliating." "It's not humiliating. You say that because you're not currently having a psychological crisis." That earned a quiet laugh from him. God, I loved making him laugh. The realization hit me, so suddenly I almost stopped breathing. Not attraction. Not tension. Something worse. I looked away quickly. Dangerous move. "Axel." The softness in his voice nearly killed me. I rubbed both hands over my face. "I think my brain's overheating." "Probably. You're being way too calm about this." "I'm not calm," Dylan admitted. "I'm trying not to scare you." I looked back at him immediately. "You don't scare me." That answer came from somewhere honest and automatic. And judging by Dylan's expression, it affected him more than I intended. His eyes searched my face carefully before he asked, quieter this time. "Not even a little?" I should have lied. Instead, I admitted the truth. Only in the way important things do. The room went still. Dylan looked at me like he was trying very hard not to cross some line. Which, unfortunately, only made me want him closer. "You know what's funny?" I said weakly. "What?" "I spent like 3 days being jealous of your phone." That startled an actual laugh out of him. "Axel." "I know. Horrific behavior." "You were jealous?" "Deeply. Very embarrassing for me." His smile lingered this time. "It was my ex," he admitted quietly. "The messages." The confirmation hit strangely hard. Not painful exactly. Just real. "She keeps wanting to talk things through," he continued. "And I keep not knowing how to explain that the problem wasn't really her." I swallowed slowly. Because suddenly I understood exactly what he meant. Dylan leaned back slightly against the couch cushions, studying me. "You want to know the really bad part? There's a worse part. I think I realized something was changing with me the first week you were here." My pulse jumped instantly. "What?" He looked mildly miserable now. You came downstairs half asleep wearing that gray hoodie, he said. And I remember thinking you looked comfortable here. I blinked. That's the bad part. The bad part, he clarified carefully, was how much I liked that feeling. Something warm unfolded painfully in my chest. Because I remembered that hoodie. Remembered that morning. I had no idea he'd been noticing me too. You never acted weird, I said softly. Dylan gave me a look. Axel, I started making coffee 30 minutes earlier because I learned you liked it hot when you came downstairs. My brain fully shut down. You did what? His expression immediately shifted toward regret. Okay, hearing it out loud makes me sound insane. No, I said quickly. No, actually that's. I stopped myself. Because what I almost said was devastatingly honest. That's the nicest thing anyone's done for me in years. The silence after that felt different. Closer somehow. Dylan looked at me carefully, like he was waiting for me to pull away now that everything was finally out in the open. Instead, I moved closer without thinking. Not dramatically, just enough that our knees touched. The second they did, Dylan inhaled quietly. Tiny reaction. Huge effect on me. You know, he said softly. You keep doing things like that. Like what? Looking at me like you already trust me. The words hit harder than they should have. Because trust had always been difficult for me. Slow. Careful. But with Dylan, it happened before I even realized it was happening. Maybe because he never demanded anything from me. Never pushed. He just stayed steady. And after the fire, after losing the place that felt safest, I think some part of me grabbed onto that immediately. I do trust you, I admitted quietly. Dylan's expression changed instantly. Not triumph. Not surprise. Something more vulnerable than that. Like hearing it mattered deeply. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he reached over slowly and took my hand. Simple. Gentle. Intentional. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. Because no one had touched me like this in a long time. Like they were trying to hold something carefully instead of just possess it. Dylan looked down briefly at our hands before speaking again. You should know, he said quietly. I'm trying very hard not to kiss you right now. Every coherent thought vanished from my brain. I stared at him. You saying that, I managed weakly, is objectively the opposite of helping. That finally broke the tension enough for him to laugh again. But he didn't let go of my hand. And neither did I. I don't remember who moved first. Later, I tried to reconstruct it logically, some clear sequence of events where one of us made a deliberate decision and the other responded. But honestly, it just happened. 1 second Dylan was looking at me with that careful expression like he was still trying to hold himself back. The next, I was close enough to feel his breathing. And then we kissed. Softly at first. Almost cautiously. Like both of us needed confirmation this was real. The second it happened, something inside my chest tightened so hard it actually hurt. Not bad hurt. Just overwhelming. Because I'd been wanting this for longer than I realized. Dylan's hand slid carefully along my jaw again, grounding me instantly. The kiss deepened slightly, still gentle, still unhurried, but now there was certainty behind it. God, I think I made some humiliating noise into his mouth because Dylan pulled back just enough to laugh quietly against my forehead. You okay? He murmured. No, I admitted honestly. I think I died actually. That earned another soft laugh. And there it was again. That warmth. Every time he laughed around me, the room felt lighter. Dylan rested his forehead briefly against mine, eyes closed for a second like he was collecting himself. You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that. The confession sent another wave of heat straight through me. How long? He opened one eye slightly. You really want to know? Yes. Dylan exhaled slowly through his nose. The night you came downstairs after the nightmare, he admitted quietly. The one where we watched that terrible documentary. My stomach flipped immediately. That long. You hit it well. I absolutely did not. I laughed softly. Fair. But hearing it affected me more than I expected. Because that night had mattered to me too. The first time I'd felt genuinely calm after the fire. The first time this house started feeling less temporary. And apparently Dylan had been feeling the shift too. For a while neither of us spoke. We just sat there close together, hands tangled loosely between us while rain kept tapping softly against the windows. It should have felt awkward. Instead it felt strangely inevitable. Like something that had been quietly happening for weeks finally stopped pretending to be subtle. Dylan looked down at our hands thoughtfully. You know this timing is objectively terrible. I snorted. Thank you for bringing logic into this. I'm serious. I know. And he was right. because suddenly reality started creeping back in around the edges. I was living in his house. Temporarily. My life was still technically a disaster. And now somehow I developed feelings for the one stable thing in it. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Dylan seemed to read half that thought directly off my face. "Hey," he said softly. I looked up. "You don't have to panic." Too late. A smile pulled briefly at his mouth. Then his expression gentled again. "I'm not asking anything from you." That hit me immediately. Because he meant it. No pressure. No expectations. No emotional cornering. Just honesty. And maybe that was the exact reason I was already falling apart over him. "I know," I admitted quietly. Dylan's thumb brushed lightly across the back of my hand once. "You've had a rough few weeks," he said carefully. "I don't want this to become another thing that feels unstable." My chest tightened painfully, because somehow, even now, he was thinking about how to make me feel safe. I looked at him for a long second before speaking. "You know what the problem is?" "What?" "You keep saying things that make me like you more." That startled a real laugh out of him again. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm having that issue too." The room felt smaller now. Warmer. At some point I shifted closer without thinking, and Dylan immediately adjusted beside me naturally, like he'd been trying not to do that all night. Comfortable. That was the dangerous part. Being near him already felt comfortable. Not intense in a chaotic way. Not reckless. Just right. And honestly, that terrified me more than anything else. Because people who feel right can hurt you the worst when they leave. The thought must have shown on my face somehow. Dylan's expression changed instantly. "What happened?" I blinked. "What?" "You disappeared for a second." Of course he noticed. I looked down at our hands, then quietly admitted the truth. "I think I'm waiting for this to stop feeling real." The word sat heavily between us. Dylan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly closer until our shoulders touched fully. Solid. Warm. Present. Then he said quietly, "Axel." I looked up. "I'm not temporary." The sentence hit somewhere so deep inside me, it almost knocked the air from my lungs. Because suddenly I realized that maybe this wasn't just about attraction, or timing, or loneliness after the fire. Maybe part of me had already started attaching to Dylan because he was the first thing that felt steady after everything burned down. And somehow he understood that without me explaining it. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Dylan noticed immediately. "Hey," he said softly. I laughed weakly. "You gotta stop being nice to me." "Not likely." And before I could overthink it again, I leaned forward and kissed him first this time. Dylan inhaled quietly against my mouth like it surprised him. Then his hand slid carefully into my hair, and suddenly I forgot every coherent thought I'd ever had. The kiss changed things. Not dramatically, not all at once. But afterward, sitting there with Dylan's hand still tangled carefully in my hair, it became impossible to pretend this was some passing moment we'd laugh about later. This was real now. And honestly, that realization should have scared me more than it did. Dylan pulled back just enough to look at me properly. "You okay?" he asked again quietly. I laughed under my breath. "You ask that a lot. You answer differently every time." "Fair." I looked at him for a second too long, then admitted the truth. "I think this is the calmest I've felt since the fire." The words slipped out before I could filter them. Dylan's expression softened immediately. Not pity. Never pity. Just understanding. "That's probably why this feels intense," he said gently. I frowned slightly. "You think I'm confusing trauma with feelings?" "No," he replied instantly. "I think both things can exist at the same time." That answer settled something in me unexpectedly. Because he wasn't dismissing this. Wasn't rushing it either. He was just honest. God, I was completely screwed. For a while we stayed like that on the couch, talking quietly while rain kept falling outside. Small things mostly. Stories about terrible apartments. His old job. The time I accidentally got banned from a grocery store at 19 for knocking over an entire wine display. "You did what?" "It wasn't entirely my fault." "How much of it was your fault?" "Emotionally, 40%. Dylan laughed so hard, he actually leaned forward. And watching that happen, watching him fully relax around me, did something dangerous to my chest. Because Dylan smiling was one thing. Dylan happy because of me? Way worse. Eventually, the conversation slowed naturally. The room stayed dim and warm around us. At some point, I realized my head had ended up resting against his shoulder without me consciously deciding to do that. Dylan didn't react immediately, just adjusted slightly so I'd be more comfortable. The tiny gesture nearly destroyed me emotionally. "You know," I murmured against his hoodie. You're suspiciously good at this. At what? This. He looked down slightly. Sitting on a couch? You know that's not what I mean. His mouth twitched faintly. Then after a second he admitted quietly. I think I spent a long time pretending not to want things. The honesty in his voice made my chest ache again. I tilted my head slightly to look at him better. That sounds exhausting. It was. For a second his expression turned distant. Thoughtful. Then he glanced back at me. You want to know something embarrassing? Always. The first few days you lived here, he admitted. I kept reminding myself you were temporary. My stomach flipped immediately. Why is that embarrassing? Because it stopped working very quickly. Neither of us looked away after that. The air between us shifted again. Quieter now. More vulnerable. Dylan brushed his fingers lightly against mine where our hands rested together. You made the house feel different, he said softly. The sentence hit me harder than almost anything else tonight. Because I knew exactly what he meant. This place had changed for me too. It stopped feeling like emergency housing weeks ago. Somewhere between midnight conversations and coffee in the kitchen and Dylan quietly paying attention to everything about me. It started feeling like home. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. Because homes can disappear. I think Dylan saw something change in my expression right then. His hand tightened gently around mine. You're doing that thing again, he murmured. What thing? Looking like you're about to brace for impact. I stared at him, then laughed weakly because he was absolutely right. I don't know how you keep reading my mind. I'm not reading your mind, he said softly. I'm reading your face. That's somehow worse. A quiet smile crossed his face. Then he reached up and brushed his fingers carefully through my hair once. The tenderness of the gesture nearly undid me completely. You really got scared, huh? He asked quietly. Not about tonight. About the fire. About losing everything. About instability. I swallowed hard before answering. Yeah. Dylan nodded slowly like he already knew. Then he said the exact wrong thing in the softest possible voice. You don't have to keep waiting for things to disappear. My throat tightened immediately. Because suddenly I realized how exhausting that waiting had become. Always preparing. Always expecting people to leave. Places to vanish. Good things to end. And somehow Dylan had noticed that too. Before I could stop myself, I leaned forward and hugged him. Not graceful. Not planned. Just instinct. For one startled second, Dylan froze slightly. Then his arms wrapped around me, immediately steady and warm and close enough that my entire chest hurt. We stayed like that longer than we probably needed to. But neither of us let go quickly. And somewhere in the quiet warmth of Dylan holding me against him while rain hit softly outside, I realized something terrifying. I didn't just want him anymore. I was already starting to need him. The problem with needing someone is that your brain immediately starts searching for reasons it's a bad idea. Mine was working overtime by the next morning. I woke up disoriented for half a second, sunlight spilling across the guest room walls, before everything from the night before hit me all at once. Dylan. The couch. The kissing. The way he held me afterward like it was the most natural thing in the world. My stomach flipped violently. Oh no, I muttered into my pillow. Not because I regretted it. That was the issue. I didn't regret any of it. Which meant this was real enough to actually matter. Dangerous. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, trying to mentally prepare myself for seeing him again. By the time I finally opened my bedroom door, I'd convinced myself things would probably feel awkward. Instead, I walked downstairs to find Dylan standing in the kitchen making coffee like absolutely nothing catastrophic had happened to my emotional stability. He glanced up immediately when he heard me and smiled. Small, warm, sleepy around the edges. My entire nervous system malfunctioned again. Morning, he said softly. That voice was unfair before coffee. Morning, I managed. For one terrifying second, neither of us moved. Then Dylan held up a second mug casually. I made yours already. Right. Of course he did. Because apparently this man's favorite hobby was destroying me psychologically through acts of service. I took the mug carefully, fingers brushing his briefly. Tiny contact. Huge effect. Dylan definitely noticed the way I immediately looked down afterward because his mouth twitched slightly. You okay? You gotta stop asking me that. Never. I laughed weakly into the coffee cup, mostly to avoid looking directly at him. The kitchen felt different now. Closer somehow. Not tense. Just aware. Like every movement between us carried new meaning. Dylan leaned back against the counter, watching me quietly for a second before speaking again. You look nervous. That's because I am. Why? I stared at him incredulously. Dylan, we crossed like 14 emotional boundaries last night. That's true. And now you're acting weirdly calm again. He huffed a quiet laugh. Axel, internally I'm still freaking out. Good. That helps me emotionally. Another smile. God, I was in serious trouble. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Dylan's expression softened slightly. Come here. The words hit differently this morning. Less charged. More intimate somehow. Still devastating. I stepped closer automatically. The second I did, Dylan reached up and brushed his fingers lightly against my wrist before taking my hand carefully in his. Simple gesture. But my chest tightened immediately anyway. You know what I realized? He said quietly. What? You relax the second someone touches you gently. The observation hit embarrassingly hard. Because he was right. I looked down at our hands. That feels psychologically revealing. It is. Rude. Dylan laughed softly. Then his thumb brushed once across my knuckles. You don't have to panic around me, he said gently. There it was again. That steadiness. The thing about Dylan was that every reassuring thing he said sounded believable because he acted like he meant it. No games. No uncertainty. No making me guess. And maybe that was exactly why I felt so emotionally exposed around him already. I'm trying not to, I admitted quietly. His expression softened further. You're doing okay. I think that might have been the exact moment I realized I could get addicted to Dylan being kind to me, which felt like a serious concern. The day itself passed strangely normally after that. Dylan worked. I answered emails and dealt with insurance calls and tried not to stare at him every 5 seconds from across the house. Unsuccessfully, because now that everything was out in the open, my brain noticed him even more. The way he concentrated while reading, how he loosened up when comfortable, the fact that he unconsciously looked for me whenever entering a room. And worst of all, sometimes I'd catch him already looking at me first. Every single time, something warm unfolded painfully in my chest. By evening, the tension between us had shifted from uncertain to something quieter. Less panic, more gravity. Like both of us understood this mattered now. We ended up cooking together mostly because Dylan claimed I was legally incapable of making proportionate amounts of pasta. That's not true. You made enough for a football team. What if they arrive unexpectedly? That's not how football teams work. I laughed while reaching for plates and accidentally bumped into him in the narrow kitchen. Both of us froze immediately, not because the contact was inappropriate, because it felt natural. Dylan looked down at me for a second too long. Then softly, you have no idea how difficult you are to ignore. My heart nearly stopped. You were ignoring me? Trying to. How'd that go for you? That depends, he murmured. How much dignity do you think I have left? I laughed again, quieter this time. And suddenly we were standing very close together in the warm kitchen while pasta boiled forgotten behind us. Dylan's eyes flicked briefly to my mouth before returning upward. The movement sent heat straight through me. You know, I said softly. You keep looking at me like you're about to kiss me again. His expression shifted immediately. Maybe I am. The honesty of that answer absolutely ruined me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then the smoke detector went off because apparently we'd forgotten food existed entirely. I startled so hard I nearly dropped a plate. Dylan burst out laughing immediately while reaching for the stove. Oh my God, I groaned. This is humiliating. You almost burned my kitchen down after surviving one fire. That feels narratively disrespectful. He was still laughing while opening windows. And standing there watching him genuinely happy, relaxed, alive in a way I hadn't seen when we first met, I felt something settle inside my chest quietly and completely. Because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, Dylan had become tied to my sense of safety now. Not the house. Not the temporary room upstairs. Him. And honestly, that terrified me more than the fire ever did.